So thank you, everybody, and welcome back to Big Ideas on the Go. I'm excited to have as our guest today, Dan Power. Dan has been kind of a long time advisor, consultant, expert in the areas of data governance. Dan, thank you very much for joining us on this.
Thanks for having me.
So, maybe just to kick things off a little bit for our audience, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background in data governance and maybe what you're doing today as well?
Sure. Thank you, Dimitri. Very happy to be here today and hope everyone listening finds it valuable. I've been in the data world pretty much my whole career, have basically, done about half my time in corporate America and half my time as a consultant. Went out and started my own consulting firm in 2007. And did that for about 10 years, focusing really on master data management and data governance and data strategy. Got to work with a lot of Fortune 500 firms, had a lot of fun, but eventually was tired of the travel. So I was looking for a more stable position. Ended up with State Street Bank in Boston, great firm. Really liked the idea that, with financial services, a lot of complexity, a lot of regulation, a lot of systems. Didn't think it would get boring anytime soon, which it hasn't, and have really been excited to be part of their kind of digital transformation as State Street has been, upgrading its internal infrastructure and culture to better deal with, data management and data governance and data strategy.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about State Street. Obviously, they've been around for a long time, collected a lot of data over the years. I'm sure have kind of looked at a variety of tooling. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've learned in terms of the evolution of data governance. And again, happy to have you also kind of weigh in around that intersection between MDM and data governance and where you see that connection.
It's interesting because the topic of MDM, master data management, comes up usually pretty early on because people intuitively know that, hey, we should have a single source of truth for this, for things like customer data, legal entities, vendors, parts, products, items, and if you're lucky enough to be, for example, on a single ERP system across your whole firm, you essentially have that, whether it be Oracle or SAP or NetSuite or whatever. That's the book of record for those things, including all the reference data around them. So, for example, one of the places I worked with is Dun & Bradstreet, and their claim to fame was they had over 250 million companies globally, and that was a great set of reference data alongside of your customer data, for example, or your vendor data, to give you a DUNS number and help you, figure out and triangulate the identity of all of your customers or vendors in this example. So, for firms that are not as lucky, they may have, multiple competing sources of truth. And, system A has, one version of the name, system B has another, system C has a third, and, which one is right. So MDM attempts to resolve that through, various algorithms, but to say, this is the trusted or golden source record for that customer. And we've resolved all the internal discrepancies so that you have that one trusted record. But that brings up a lot of governance questions that, well, why did you pick that division's record over mine? Because, my data is better. So there's a lot of, kind of finger pointing and, calling the baby ugly that goes on politically. And what it really made me realize, and I see this played out at State Street too, is that data governance is inherently a political process because there is always going to be organizational questions, silos, political turf, even personalities that have to be reconciled. And that, for me, is fun. I kind of enjoy being like a data diplomat and helping, different parties get together. We just had a conference call right before I came on today. It was two different parts of State Street talking about pricing of securities. And, you gave us one price and, we looked it up in Bloomberg and we got another, and why are they different and that type of thing. So it's just an endless series of, interventions really between different groups in the firm to help get them onto the same page, at least as part of it. Obviously there's a technology component, which is important. And, we're in the process of upgrading, a big chunk of our technology stack around data management. And BigID is a part of that. But the more interesting part for me is really the people and the culture, and how do you get a firm like State Street, which is a big incumbent financial services player, into the 21st century, and to become to go through a digital transformation, and to realize you've got to simplify your processes, you've got to eliminate non-value added processes, you've got to streamline and then automate. And we have a big chunk of our processes that are still manual, but the problem is the people doing those processes are eventually going away, and we have to put either a program or a robot or whatever you want to call it, AI, in their place, because everyone is trying to move up the value add food chain and actually add more value, rather than just being a typist and saying, okay, I've got an order that came in via fax, I have to type it into the mainframe, and then whatever. Now we're getting all those trading venues and everything automated, and we're kind of all becoming essentially data analysts, and making human judgments where the AI isn't able to make them. Is this a false positive or false negative, or is it right? And we need to have human beings that can kind of sit in that judgment loop at the end and kind of give thumbs up or thumbs down to what the AI has said. So we have a long way to go on that, obviously, but we're starting down that road.
Yeah, and the lessons for other organizations, obviously, State Street is unique, very established, lots of lines of business, but this kind of whole thesis around shifting the role of the human to more of a data analyst, to more kind of validate and arbitrate, as opposed to maybe in the classical kind of governance argot, being kind of around curation. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the actual practice of data governance, whether it's stewardship, defining data definitions and glossaries, workflow. How is that being evolved because of some of this kind of shift to AI and ML?
It is happening for sure. The analogy I use most often is to liken it to data archaeology. So, the old-fashioned way was you send people out into the field, they dig around in the dirt, they uncover artifacts, and they brush them off and study them, and bring them back and try to assemble them into a giant skeleton of a T-Rex. Nowadays, we're trying to automate all that. So the digging is automated, the brushing off is automated, and everything kind of shows up on the data steward's desk, and then they have to curate it and put it together into the T-Rex skeleton, or their portion of the T-Rex skeleton. We have like 3,000 applications. So, and we have stewards assigned to almost every one of them. Some of the kind of higher, more critical applications, we've already done a very thorough stewardship job on, and now we're moving on to the rest, which is about the other 75%. I think we've done about 600 out of 3,000, and now we're doing the remainder. But what we're finding is we're starting to move away from that more manual process, where there's a lot of reverse engineering and even the reading of code, and interviewing business owners and technical owners and programmers, and reading specs and going back over old document repositories, because that only works so well, especially if you're going back into some of the older applications. There's no one left to interview. Those people have all long since retired or moved on. And so you can't really, with legacy systems, you can't really do too much archaeology. They're essentially a closed system, and you can study the inputs going in and the outputs coming out, but the amount of documentation for what actually goes on under the hood is pretty minimal. We're still going to have to deal with that, obviously, but what we're trying to get to is repositories, databases, applications can be automatically scanned, and then the steward, instead of having to kind of send in the request for the scan and wait 2 months and then go over the results, they can go straight to the go over the results part and start curating and tagging and categorizing, and essentially teaching the AI to do it better next time, so that there'll be less of that manual poring over the results later on, because the machine gets smarter and smarter over time.
Yeah, no, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. So maybe shifting a little bit to kind of a related topic, both connected to MDM and frankly data governance, around data quality, right? Data quality, as you mentioned, a lot of systems, some of them are quite old, from the fax typing into mainframe era. You're going to have some inconsistency of quality. Clearly, you have some new applications around BI, AI, maybe some hopes around commercializing data as well at some point. how are you approaching quality? And maybe on a related subject, if you talk a little bit about that, what are your thoughts around data observability and the relationship between that and quality?
This is a really good question, and it's a particular interest area of mine for whatever reason. I've always been kind of a data quality junkie. The issue is it's not just fitness for purpose; it's fitness for purpose in what context? Because usually the data is perfectly fine in the source application that it comes from. Someone has keyed it into that trading application or that AP application or whatever it might be, and it doesn't set off any alarm bells. There's no exceptions. It's fine. Yes, you left a few fields blank, but they're not required anyway, so we're all good. The problem comes, with the fitness for purpose of that data as you move into another application that's getting a feed or a message or some type of data integration from the original application. Now that you've moved beyond the system of record to this downstream system, that's when problems arise because their system was coded differently. And now those missing fields that you didn't really care about are big deals to them because they're sorting, categorizing, reporting, whatever they're doing on those fields, which in this case are bad because they're missing. They could be, bad in a different way. We like to look at dimensions of data quality, and even with the legacy systems, you don't really know what the data was, whether it was bad or not inside the application. But sure enough, when you bring it out, it's pretty bad. It's missing things. There's things coded wrong. And part of it is just reconciling what I call the Tower of Babel problem. In one application, male female is indicated by M or F. In another application, it's indicated by 0 or 1. And so they have the same data, but it's just coded differently. So you need almost a ability to translate or harmonize between systems. It's not really a data quality issue. It's teaching the machine to realize that, in this system, it's M or F, and this other system, it's 0 or 1. And really, they're both right. You just have to be able to kind of translate back and forth. But observability is a good question. Part of it is just the quantity. We do some of our applications grow by 500 million records a day because they're pricing things where we're getting prices at the millisecond level all day long during the trading day. And just because of the size of those databases, we can only keep the most recent 30 days. So if you want a price from 2 years ago, at least from that application, you're kind of out of luck. And the quality picture it's one that we're really in the process of changing our approach to. Instead of saying to the application owners and the IT teams that support them and either develop or maintain those applications, hey, you have to do this yourself. Data quality is really an inherent function that's very important to the bank, but the onus is on you. Now what we're saying is, look, if you don't want to code this from scratch in Java or PL SQL or C or whatever you're using, we can help you. We have a data quality utility that allows you to build those data quality checks more easily, keep a catalog of them. So when the auditors show up saying, hey, show us a list of all your data quality checks, it's much easier to give them that and to share them. Because, if there's a data quality check that works really well for function A, it might work really well for function B if they could discover it and use it. So there's a lot. It's essentially a step change from the kind of very distributed way that we're doing data quality today, which works, but it's a lot of effort, to a more centralized, data quality tool-driven approach, where we will have the ability to kind of manage that catalog of data quality checks and controls, and to share them, and provide tested data quality checks that are already in use that you can just use instead of having to create them from scratch, and less developer oriented. Or they call it no code, low code, but I would really say it's more just different code. Someone else is writing that code that may not be proficient in the original language like Java, but they are proficient in this data quality toolkit, and they bring the ability to write data quality checks, hopefully in less time. So instead of writing 40 lines of Java code, you could, with a couple of clicks of the buttons, you can put together a data quality check that does the same thing, but it takes less time to write and to maintain. So that's where we're headed. We have a long way to go, Part of it is we just need to turn off some of these old systems. We need to get our number of systems down from, we have 39,000 employees. We have 3,000 applications. You can do the math on what the ratio is for, number of employees supported by each application. It's not very high. So we want to consolidate where we can. Instead of, 4 business units having 4 different applications to do essentially the same thing, and they each have, their own little silo. We want all 4 of them to use one application. So that's another cultural change is, going through the process of reconciling those applications and shutting down the old ones and kind of picking a winner that, okay, this is the most modern or this is the best for that particular purpose. We should all use that rather than having, 4 separate platforms for the same thing.
And out of curiosity, we talked a little bit about kind of the application of ML, whether it's kind of identifying kind of the rule sets that you want to measure against or automating some of the traditional workload for a steward. I am curious, as it applies to quality, data governance, MDM, how do you see the cloud impacting that? The shift from workloads in the kind of classic data center, maybe on mainframe, to the cloud, does that change anything? Or are the rules around ML the same and every other kind of automation effort the same?
From one standpoint, it changes everything because it's much easier to get to that data source if it's in a commonly accessible cloud repository that, you don't have to be physically wired into that data center to get to. You just have to have the right credentials. Of course, it makes the granting of those credentials much more critical because, basically anybody in the world could access that data. Since it's out there in the cloud. But at the same time, to the machine learning world, data is data. They don't really care where they get it. As long as you can make it repeatable and scalable, they're going to go through different kinds of data for different purposes, training data, production data, test data, etc. But, whether something's coming from an on-premise repository or a cloud repository, it doesn't really matter. It's sometimes easier to get to one than the other. But in the end, what really matters is the quality of the data. Like if I'm designing an AI to make, decisions automatically on anything, I don't want to feed it bad data. Garbage in, garbage out is bad enough. But when you're like automatically decisioning that garbage data and making in essence, garbage decisions, that's bad. So we are working really hard to kind of get that foundation extended to include, inbuilt data quality. So the data going into the models is as high integrity and trustworthy as it can be. Because if you think it's bad now, when someone looks at a report and says, I just don't trust the data on this report. Well, guess what? When the report is actually a set of decisions made by a machine, and you've got impacts now on your customer base or your employees or your suppliers or the community at large, you definitely don't want to be the one getting the bad news of, well, guess what? We kind of made a mistake in our training data. And as a result, the machine has been making all these automated decisions that aren't worth the silicon that they were recorded on. You don't want to be that guy. So you want to make sure you build in that, that whole process into the development cycle of debiasing and testing those outcomes, because otherwise you wind up with AI, like facial recognition systems that can't recognize Black females as being human. And that's very easy to have happen if the only people who are providing you with training data happen to be white male engineers. That is exactly the kind of outcome you should expect. But it's one that's pretty easy to avoid if you extend the definition of data quality to include data debiasing, which I think we should. We should always say, okay, I understand this data is clean, but does it contain hidden biases that are going to affect the outcomes from our AI? That should be a routine question now.
Yeah, it's kind of I sometimes refer to it as the Glenn Ross problem in data. You want, it's all about finding the good data, like it was maybe 80 years ago, finding the good leads, right? So maybe we touched on a lot here, and I appreciate kind of your insight. Any other trends that have piqued your interest over the last year or two that you think our audience needs to be watchful of?
I think the biggest trend for me is that people are starting to realize that, if you're going to be a large enterprise and have scalability and have all the other things that we want around automation and high quality data, You just can't do it in Excel anymore. Excel is great as a spreadsheet, a what if tool for, budgeting or whatever. But, we really shouldn't be trying to manage the security and privacy of our data, our lineage, none of those things really. A modern data governance infrastructure doesn't work in Excel. Sharing spreadsheets in Microsoft Teams, the minute you go down that road, you're dooming yourself to inaccurate metadata, to out of date metadata, to lineage that, the first time a regulator looks at it, it's going to come apart at the seams. You really have to have a modern tool set and apply the same kind of automation you would apply to anything. Essentially it's CRM, which is obviously a very old trend, but we need to apply those same trends and techniques and automations to data management. And we've been doing, a lot of it by hand or through homegrown programs, but it's not really a core competency that anybody should aspire to, except for people like you. Companies shouldn't be, building their own data quality solutions, but a lot do. Companies shouldn't be building their own master data management systems either, and some do. So we have to kind of get past the build mentality to the buy mentality and understand how to put together components. Much like in the old days of stereo, you couldn't buy a good stereo from one manufacturer. So you'd get the speakers from one people and the receiver from another and the amp from someone else. And you plug it all together and hopefully it would work, and hopefully it would kind of meet your expectations around the quality of the resulting sound. There isn't one vendor out there that covers everything from an MDM to data governance to data quality to AI. You have to kind of cobble together the components. They call it the best of breed. Hopefully it is the best. But one thing I know is you really can't do it yourself. This stuff is rocket science, and you really can't do it manually, using meetings and Outlook emails and spreadsheets. It's just not possible.
Yeah, no, I agree with your kind of synthesis around this idea of taking that best of breed approach. I think very similar to kind of service oriented architecture, and even web services, right, where you can kind of componentize and integrate ideally kind of just in time, so you can plug things in and out, but wholeheartedly agree. Dan, this was great. Thank you very much for coming on our podcast and sharing a little bit of your wisdom, both at State Street and kind of pre-State Street. So thank you again. And maybe for our audience, I'd like to again remind you to please go to where you download your podcasts on Apple or Spotify. Please subscribe and leave comments. And with that, Dan, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks very much, Dimitri. Great talking to you today. Hope everybody has a great rest of the day.